It began in the summer of 1851, deep in the heart of Alabama, when an unnerving legend was born, one that would linger in the shadows of history. The events of that year still whisper through the town's forgotten corners, passed on as a chilling tale of mystery. A young red-haired girl, no older than 10, was seen running through the dense woods, her wild, copper strands glinting in the moonlight. Her pale skin, almost ghostly in the dim light, only heightened the eerie aura of the scene. It was a hot, humid evening, but the air seemed to freeze around her as she sprinted barefoot across the untamed land, the sounds of her hurried footsteps swallowed by the thick southern woods. A haunting silence fell over the land, broken only by the occasional rustle of leaves or the distant chirp of crickets. Her desperate flight wasn't the only oddity that night. According to those who later spoke of it, she was not alone. Others had heard whispers, voices seemingly calling her from the shadows. Some claimed to have seen figures moving with her, their forms barely visible among the trees, watching from the periphery of the moon's light. No one knew exactly who she was or why she ran with such urgency. And by the time anyone reached the location where she was last seen, there was nothing left but a strange, cold feeling that enveloped the area, an unsettling sense that something otherworldly had just passed through. This moment would mark the beginning of a series of strange occurrences that would haunt the town for years. As the word spread about the peculiar incident, the townsfolk began to whisper of something far darker at play. The girl was not the first of her kind, nor would she be the last. Over the next few weeks, reports of other red-haired girls began to surface, all born into slavery, each carrying a feature that was completely out of place in the predominantly black population of the region. In a place where dark skin was the defining trait, these girls' flame-like hair became an enigma, one that was quickly wrapped in fear and superstition. People began to notice the red-haired girls wherever they went, working the fields, walking through the town, their hair standing out like a fiery beacon. They moved in pairs or groups, always seemingly together, never straying too far from one another. Their hair, so bright it almost seemed unnatural, became the subject of much speculation. Local folklore quickly tied them to old myths, stories of magical creatures or cursed beings. Some believed they were descendants of a long-forgotten race, others suggested they were the product of some strange genetic anomaly. But in a town where the lives of enslaved people were already regarded as insignificant by most, their difference became a symbol of fear. The enslaved black community itself began to whisper of the red-haired girls, some saying they were marked by a higher power, cursed with a knowledge that no one could understand. It wasn't long before the town's rumors turned into something darker. The red-haired girls became the subject of superstition and fear. People began to say that they were not simply unusual, but were marked by the devil himself. In the eyes of the slave owners, the appearance of these girls was unnatural, an affront to the order of the world they had carefully constructed. Some believed they were a portent of bad things to come, while others speculated that they were some form of witch or mystical being, sent to disrupt the delicate balance between the enslaved and their masters. In an era where religious fervor was deeply entwined with daily life, it didn't take long for the local clergy to denounce the very notion of supernatural influence. But the fear persisted. Local gossip grew with each passing day. Some said that the girls could speak to spirits, while others claimed they could heal with a touch or curse with a glance. Those who interacted with the girls were said to be forever marked, changed by an invisible, intangible force that could not be explained by logic or reason. Children who played near them often reported hearing strange whispers, words that seemed foreign, even though no one in the area spoke anything but English. But what truly sealed the girls' fate was the inexplicable, gradual disappearance of a number of them. Over time, the red-haired girls simply vanished, one by one, without leaving any trace. Some reports claimed they were taken by abolitionists, their disappearance a desperate escape from the harsh realities of slavery. Others suggested that they had been claimed by the very spirits or supernatural forces they were believed to be connected to. Whatever the truth was, the mysterious nature of their existence had captured the collective imagination of the town. The local authorities, desperate to maintain order and discourage superstition, dismissed the strange occurrences as mere rumors, as nothing more than stories spun by frightened or uneducated people. But it was hard to ignore the whispers that never truly stopped. The disappearances, the rumors of strange phenomena, and the oddity of the girl's very presence became a dark chapter in Alabama's history, one that would remain largely untouched by official accounts but would persist in the oral traditions of the local population for years to come. As time passed, those who remembered the red-haired girls continued to speak of them in hushed tones, often in private, far away from the prying eyes of those who chose to remain ignorant of the past. The town carried on, and the years moved forward, but the stories never truly died. Even after the Civil War and the end of slavery, whispers of the red-haired girls remained, perhaps not as widely spoken of, but still alive in the minds of those who had witnessed their strange presence. This section marks the beginning of the mystery that would unfold over the following years, laying the groundwork for an eerie investigation into a phenomenon that history would ultimately choose to forget, or perhaps never fully understand. What had happened to these girls? Were they merely victims of circumstances, marked by an inexplicable trait that set them apart? Or were they something far darker, beings who carried with them a secret that no one dared to uncover? Their story would continue to haunt the townspeople for generations, and the fear that they sparked would become an indelible part of Alabama's macabre history. In order to understand the strange phenomenon of the red-haired girls and their unsettling place in Alabama's history, it is essential to first grasp the social and economic landscape of the region during the mid-1800s. Alabama, a state steeped in the grim realities of slavery, was a place where every corner seemed to whisper of a darker past, shaped by the harsh system that governed the lives of its people. The presence of the red-haired girls, an anomaly in a population mostly of African descent, could not be considered without acknowledging the history of racial dynamics that underpinned the entire Southern experience. The year was 1851, and Alabama, like much of the South, was a state defined by its plantation economy. The cotton industry was thriving, and the land was vast, its wealth rooted in the forced labor of enslaved people. The air was thick with the sound of whips cracking in the fields, the cries of the oppressed, and the murmurs of those who sought any kind of escape from the cruel system that trapped them. In towns like the one where the red-haired girls appeared, life was governed by rigid social codes that allowed little room for deviation, especially in the case of the enslaved black population. The plantations that dotted Alabama's countryside were home to thousands of slaves, whose labor was the backbone of the state's economy. In the eyes of most of the white population, the enslaved were seen as mere property, tools to be used, exploited, and discarded. However, the presence of a group of enslaved girls with red hair, a physical trait so out of place in the region's largely African-descended population, was a disruption to this established order. It was not just their hair that caused alarm, but their very existence seemed to challenge the natural order of things. To some, they were reminders of the vast, incomprehensible mysteries that lurked within the human experience, things that science, religion, and society had yet to explain. This disconnect between the normal and the anomalous existed within the broader context of a society entrenched in deep racial and cultural divisions. Slaveholders viewed their human property with a cold detachment, yet there was a sense of pride in the purity of their lineage, whether that was rooted in European heritage or the cultivation of a workforce that was entirely subjugated and controlled. But the appearance of these red-haired girls, with their pale skin and fiery locks, struck at the very core of these assumptions. In a world that sought to define and control, these girls seemed to defy categorization altogether. The enslaved black population, in contrast, lived in a constant state of subjugation. Their lives were reduced to labor and survival, with little regard for their humanity. Yet, in the midst of their suffering, a rich and complex culture emerged, one rooted in ancestral knowledge, oral traditions, and an ever-present spirituality that offered a sense of resilience. The supernatural and the mystical were integral parts of this cultural fabric, and tales of spirits, curses, and the unknown were often woven into the everyday lives of the enslaved. In such an environment, the emergence of the red-haired girls was seen as both a curse and a sign, a symbol of something greater, something inexplicable. In many ways, the town where the girls were first noticed was no different from others across the South, gripped by a sense of fear and suspicion. There were whispers in the fields, in the kitchens, in the hidden spaces where enslaved people could speak freely. The appearance of these girls, strange and inexplicable in their features, was seen by some as a divine sign, while others feared they were a manifestation of evil, demonic forces that had somehow found their way into the heart of the community. What they represented, and whether they were part of something larger, was a question that lingered in the minds of many. Religious belief played a significant role in shaping the town's view of these girls. Christianity, deeply ingrained in the Southern psyche, provided a lens through which to interpret nearly every event. However, the local clergy were quick to dismiss the idea of the girls being anything other than a natural anomaly. They preached the gospel of acceptance and submission, urging the enslaved to trust in God's will. But in the same breath, there was a palpable undercurrent of fear, an awareness that some forces could not be explained away with scripture or prayer. There was talk among the more superstitious of the population, both white and black, that the girls were not just the result of some random genetic mutation but were part of something far more sinister. Amidst this climate of tension and uncertainty, the appearance of the red-haired girls became a symbol of mystery, one that could not be neatly categorized or understood. Their presence defied the rigid boundaries that separated the enslaved from their oppressors, and by extension, it challenged the entire order of life in Alabama. No one could easily explain why these girls, with their strange features, had appeared in a community where such an anomaly should not have been possible. Some believed they were the result of a forgotten lineage, perhaps a remnant of the Native American tribes that once populated the area, or even an influence from foreign lands. Others wondered if they were somehow connected to ancient African tribes or peoples with extraordinary powers. But in the absence of any clear answers, fear began to take root. The town was divided by conflicting beliefs, and the uncertainty surrounding the girls only served to deepen the existing rift between the enslaved population and their masters. Slave owners, fearing any potential threat to their control, were quick to suppress rumors of supernatural activity. They dismissed the idea of witches or curses, but the whispers of strange happenings grew harder to ignore. As crops withered in the fields, animals fell sick, and mysterious accidents occurred, the fear surrounding the red-haired girls intensified. This climate of tension and superstition was not limited to Alabama alone. The entire South was steeped in racial and social turmoil during this period, with the institution of slavery at the heart of every societal issue. The appearance of these girls only served to highlight the deep inequalities and fears that defined the region. They represented the unknown, the mysterious, and the things that society was unwilling, or unable, to confront. Were they the result of an inherited trait, a bizarre quirk of genetics? Or did they represent something far darker, something that could not be explained by science or reason alone? Alabama's history, marked by a legacy of violence, exploitation, and mystery, made it the perfect backdrop for a story like that of the red-haired girls. It was a place where the line between the real and the supernatural often blurred, where legends and reality collided. As the girls' presence in the town continued to haunt the collective consciousness, the town would forever be shaped by the unanswered questions they left behind, questions that would remain unresolved for generations to come. The eerie nature of their existence, coupled with the deep divisions within the town, set the stage for a mystery that would refuse to be buried, no matter how hard the town tried to forget. The first sightings of the red-haired girls sent a ripple of fear and fascination throughout the town, unlike anything the community had experienced before. Alabama, with its history steeped in plantation culture and the subjugation of black people, had never seen a phenomenon like this, an anomaly that, with each passing day, seemed to deepen the mystery surrounding the girls. Their existence raised questions that no one could easily answer, and what began as an oddity soon turned into a source of dread and superstition. The enslaved population had long been familiar with the notion of difference, having been marked by skin color, language, and heritage. Yet this was something different, something that could not be easily explained away by the racial and social norms that had governed their lives for generations. The first red-haired girls were discovered on a small plantation outside the town, tucked away in a hidden valley surrounded by dense forests. At first, they were seen as just children, enslaved girls with peculiar features. But as people began to notice the striking color of their hair, the town's collective curiosity grew into something darker. The girl's hair was a brilliant shade of red, so vivid it seemed unnatural against the backdrop of the deep southern soil. No one could recall any of the enslaved families giving birth to children with such striking hair. The plantation owners, who had seen generations of enslaved people born under their watch, were unsettled by the girl's presence. Some thought it could be a mere coincidence, a random anomaly, but the growing number of girls with similar features soon convinced many that something deeper was at play. It was not just their hair that made them stand out. The red-haired girls were often described as having a pale complexion, a sharp contrast to the darker skin tones of most enslaved people. Their eyes, though not overtly unusual, held a certain intensity, a clarity that unsettled those who spoke to them. It was said that when they looked into a person's eyes, there was an eerie depth, as if they were seeing something beyond the present, beyond the realm of normal human understanding. Some whispered that their eyes held a spark of knowledge, a sense of awareness that set them apart from the others. The girl's unusual appearance sparked rumors that ranged from the fantastical to the terrifying. Some believed that they were the product of an ancient curse, a curse that had somehow manifested itself in this peculiar form. Others thought they might be descended from some forgotten, supernatural lineage, perhaps the result of intermingling between the enslaved Africans and some foreign or otherworldly race. The girls, with their bright red hair and unnerving presence, seemed to defy all logic, and in a society built on strict rules and boundaries, this difference could not be ignored. The enslaved people, who were often isolated from the rest of the community, began to speak in hushed tones about the red-haired girls. In the secrecy of their small quarters, they speculated about the origins of the girls and what their presence meant. Some claimed that the girls were the living embodiment of a curse placed upon them, a curse that had been handed down from ancestors long lost to time. Others believed that the red-haired girls were symbols of a spiritual awakening, beings chosen by a higher power to bring about a change in the course of history. It was not uncommon for slaves to believe in spiritual forces beyond their control, especially in a world where they were at the mercy of a brutal and dehumanizing system. Whether they saw the girls as a sign of hope or as harbingers of doom, they began to attribute a supernatural significance to them. The reaction among the white slaveholders and townspeople was more one of fear and confusion. To the white population, the girls were a curiosity, an oddity to be studied, but also a potential threat. They were seen as an affront to the social order that had been in place for centuries. The arrival of these red-haired children, marked by features so foreign, was a challenge to the rigid racial and societal boundaries that had governed the lives of the enslaved for generations. Slave owners who had carefully cultivated a sense of racial superiority began to question what these girls represented. Could they be a sign of rebellion, of something greater than they could control? At the same time, the presence of the red-haired girls stirred a deep, primal fear. The idea that these children might possess some hidden power, an ancient, forgotten magic, was a belief that took root in the minds of many. There were whispers of strange occurrences linked to their presence. Livestock began to act erratically. Crops failed for reasons that no one could explain. Even the weather seemed to change when the girls were near, storms would appear without warning, and the sky would darken, as if nature itself were responding to the girls' presence. It was as though a dark cloud followed them wherever they went. But it wasn't just the natural world that seemed to bend under the weight of their existence. People began to speak of supernatural occurrences that surrounded the girls. Some claimed to have seen the girls standing in the woods at night, where they would gather in a circle and chant in a language no one recognized. Others reported hearing strange voices, low, guttural sounds that came from the girls when they were alone, murmuring in the dark. The belief that these girls might be involved in witchcraft or some other form of occult practice began to take hold. As the girls' numbers grew, so did the intensity of the rumors. What had begun as a curious phenomenon soon became a source of growing anxiety. Some of the townspeople believed that the girls were not just innocent children, but rather agents of a greater, darker force. Whether that force was divine or demonic was a matter of heated debate. Religious leaders, many of whom were deeply entrenched in the belief that anything supernatural was the work of the devil, began to warn the community about the dangers of such beings. To them, the appearance of these girls was a clear sign that the town had fallen out of favor with God. They urged the townspeople to pray and repent, to rid themselves of the influence of these strange, cursed children. For the enslaved population, however, the red-haired girls became more than just a subject of fear. They became a symbol of hope, a sign that there was something beyond the world of slavery, something that transcended the harsh realities they endured every day. The girls' strange appearance, their seeming connection to forces beyond human understanding, sparked a flicker of belief that perhaps there was a higher power watching over them, one that could alter the course of their suffering. Whether they were seen as a divine gift or a cursed omen, the red-haired girls became the center of the enslaved community's beliefs, a symbol of something greater than themselves, a glimmer of something that could never be fully understood or explained. As these rumors spread, the town became divided. The fear of the unknown began to break down the social fabric, and the differences between the enslaved and the free became more pronounced. The red-haired girls, with their strange, ethereal presence, began to haunt the minds of everyone they came into contact with. The more people tried to explain them, the more the mystery deepened. And as the mystery of the red-haired girls grew, so did the sense of impending doom that seemed to hang over the town. Whatever the truth was behind their existence, it was clear that their presence was anything but ordinary, and the town would never be the same again. As the days passed, the presence of the red-haired girls became an undeniable subject of gossip and speculation, slowly taking root in the town's collective consciousness. What had begun as a curious anomaly soon became the focal point of every whispered conversation, every meeting, and every gathering. The air was thick with uncertainty, and fear hovered just beneath the surface, waiting for any spark to ignite it. At first, the rumors were hushed, exchanged quietly between the enslaved and the few trusted free people. But the nature of these rumors was contagious. Each retelling carried with it a different twist, a new layer of intrigue, until the tale of the red-haired girls became an ever-growing mystery that nobody could fully explain. The enslaved population, who lived in constant fear of their masters, had always relied on their own networks of communication. They shared stories of strange happenings, of whispers heard in the wind, and of signs that could not be easily understood. These informal exchanges often took place in the shadows of their quarters or deep in the woods during stolen moments of rest. It was in these hidden spaces that the true nature of the red-haired girls was first discussed. To many of the enslaved, the girls were not just an oddity but a symbol of something more. Something beyond the control of the plantation owners or even the divine order they were forced to adhere to. The red-haired girls, in the quietest corners of the town, were seen as a manifestation of powers that transcended the everyday, a reminder that the world they lived in was still full of mysteries that could not be explained by reason or religion alone. Rumors about their origins were the first to circulate. Some believed that the girls were the descendants of an ancient and forgotten race. Perhaps they were remnants of the Native American tribes that once roamed the land, whose bloodlines had become lost to time. Others whispered that they were part of an old African legend, beings that had crossed the ocean with the enslaved ancestors of the town's black population. Yet, the most unsettling theory, which began to take hold, was that the girls had been marked by supernatural forces, perhaps even divine ones. Their appearance was seen by some as a sign, a divine act of retribution or judgment. Could these girls be the harbingers of a coming reckoning, a judgment that would sweep through the land and right the wrongs of slavery? It was a thought that sent chills down the spines of both the enslaved and the free, for such a judgment could mean an end to the established social order. The peculiarities of the red-haired girls only fueled these growing rumors. There were those who claimed that they had seen them walking in the woods at night, their figures almost ghostly as they moved silently among the trees. Some swore that the girls would vanish into the forest as if they had been swallowed up by the earth itself, leaving behind only an unsettling stillness in the air. Others spoke of strange sounds, whispers, almost imperceptible, coming from the direction of the girls. These whispers were said to carry a language that no one could understand, a language so foreign that even the most learned scholars of the town could not recognize it. The very notion that the girls might speak in a language unknown to any living person was enough to send shivers through those who heard the rumors. Could they be speaking with spirits, or perhaps in tongues, as some believed? The fear of the unknown only deepened as each new story emerged. And then there were the more bizarre claims. People reported seeing the girls near the edge of town, where the land met the thick forest, standing together in what seemed like some sort of ritual. They were often described as chanting in unison, their voices rising and falling in a rhythm that was not of this world. Those who witnessed these gatherings spoke of an overwhelming sense of unease, as though the very air around them had shifted. Some townspeople, too frightened to investigate further, simply turned away, choosing to believe that these were just stories spun from fear and superstition. But for others, the thought of what the girls might be doing in the woods, and what they might be invoking, was too much to ignore. The rumors that spread among the enslaved were laced with a mixture of awe and fear. Many of them came from the older generation, who had lived through darker times and had witnessed strange things that could not be easily explained. These elders had long carried with them the stories of spirits and omens, of curses and blessings that traveled down the generations. To them, the red-haired girls were not just a curiosity, they were a sign. But a sign of what? No one could agree on the answer, and as the rumors spread, the town became increasingly divided. While the enslaved community speculated privately about the true nature of the girls, the white population took a more public stance. The slave owners, who were used to controlling everything that happened on their plantations, were unnerved by the mystery of the girls. The red-haired girls were a disruption to the system they had so carefully constructed, a challenge to the very foundations of their authority. The whispers that reached the ears of the masters were filled with fear, suspicion, and confusion. Some of the more superstitious slave owners even began to question whether the girls might be witches, or whether they were part of a plot to incite rebellion. The notion that these girls might possess powers beyond the natural world was one that could not be dismissed so easily. If they were witches, could they be cursed, or were they something far more dangerous? The fear of the unknown spread quickly among those in power. The religious leaders of the town also played a role in the rumors. Southern Christianity, with its fire and brimstone teachings, was quick to dismiss any talk of supernatural powers. They preached that the girls were merely the product of a random genetic anomaly and that their strangeness should not be elevated to divine significance. But even as they denounced the rumors from the pulpit, a part of them could not help but wonder. What was it about these girls that made so many people uneasy? Could they be possessed, or were they merely victims of a cursed fate? In private, many of the town's most respected leaders spoke of the girls in hushed tones, afraid that the fear surrounding them might take on a life of its own. The culmination of these whispers and rumors was a growing sense of panic. Fear of the girls, and what they represented, began to spread throughout the town, seeping into every conversation, every meeting, and every interaction. Some claimed to see the girls walking through the town at night, their red hair glowing like embers in the moonlight. Others swore that they saw them standing at the edges of the town, watching, waiting. The rumors fed off each other, and soon, the red-haired girls were no longer seen as merely unusual, they had become a symbol of something much larger. Whether they were divine or cursed, the girls were now viewed as a force beyond the control of the town. And so the town was left in a grip of fear, caught between the pull of superstition and the need for rational explanation. No one could decide what the girls truly represented, and the more they tried to explain them, the more mysterious they became. The tension continued to build, and the whispers grew louder, until it seemed that the very fabric of the town was unraveling under the weight of what the red-haired girls had come to symbolize. The truth, as it always does in such stories, remained elusive, just out of reach, leaving behind only fear and unanswered questions. As the rumors surrounding the red-haired girls continued to spread, the town found itself divided between those who clung to superstition and fear, and those who sought to suppress such ideas through reason and authority. The most powerful voices in the town, the religious leaders and the slave owners, began to rally against the growing speculation, denouncing the notion that the girls could be anything other than a natural, albeit strange, occurrence. They feared that any acceptance of the supernatural theories could undermine their control over the enslaved population and even threaten the delicate social order that had been in place for generations. The local clergy, whose influence over the town was immense, took it upon themselves to put an end to the spreading rumors. The pulpit, once a place for teaching salvation, became a battleground for the spiritual well-being of the community. Preachers of the town, deeply entrenched in their belief that the supernatural could only be attributed to the power of God or the devil, vehemently rejected any notion that the red-haired girls might be witches or cursed. They preached that such superstitions were sinful, a distraction from the true path of salvation. Their messages rang loud and clear in the town's churches. There was no place for such talk, no room for what they considered blasphemy. In the eyes of the clergy, these wild stories of the girls speaking in strange tongues, of strange rituals performed in the woods, were nothing more than the products of a community desperate for answers in a world they could not control. They reminded the congregation of the importance of steadfast faith in God's will and warned that any deviation from the teachings of the church would only bring ruin. The red-haired girls, in this worldview, were mere children, an oddity, yes, but not something to be feared or revered. They were just another mystery of God's design, a puzzle to be solved with faith and rationality, not one to be feared as a harbinger of doom. Despite the clergy's efforts to stifle the rumors, the tension in the town only grew. The very presence of the red-haired girls seemed to challenge the belief system that had held the town together for so long. To the clergy, any acceptance of the idea that these girls might possess supernatural powers, or that they were connected to some dark force, threatened to undermine the foundations of their teachings. The idea of witches, especially among the enslaved population, was one they could not abide. Such beliefs, they argued, had no place in their version of Christianity. But the more the religious leaders denounced the rumors, the more they seemed to feed into the fear. In trying to suppress the growing panic, they only added to it. Their sermons, though intended to reassure, came across as desperate attempts to maintain control in a situation that was slipping beyond their grasp. The townspeople, particularly the enslaved, were not easily swayed by the clergy's pleas. Many of them, steeped in their own spiritual beliefs and folk traditions, saw the girls not as victims of some divine design, but as something more powerful, something that defied explanation. The enslaved community, in particular, became more entrenched in their beliefs. For them, the red-haired girls represented something far beyond the ordinary. While the white population clung to religious authority as a means of maintaining control, the enslaved people turned to their own sources of spiritual strength. They began to look to their ancestors, to the spirits they believed guided them through the darkest moments of their lives. The girls, with their strange appearance and otherworldly presence, seemed to them a sign that the spirits were at work, that something greater than human comprehension was unfolding. In the quiet corners of the town, away from the scrutiny of their masters, the enslaved spoke in hushed tones of the girls' power, interpreting their presence as a symbol of both hope and fear. But for the white townspeople, the idea that the girls might be something other than natural was too unsettling to accept. The slave owners, concerned about losing control, began to address the matter more directly. Some took it upon themselves to warn the enslaved population that such rumors were dangerous and that belief in the girls' powers was not only sinful but could lead to insurrection. The message was clear: the town's social order was built on the unquestioning submission of the enslaved, and anything that disrupted that order had to be suppressed, forcefully if necessary. The tension between the two groups continued to escalate, as the town's leaders became more resolute in their stance. They sought to drown out the rumors, to shut down any conversation about the red-haired girls that veered into the supernatural. Yet, in doing so, they only made the topic more taboo, more potent. The more they denied the girls' possible connection to something supernatural, the more the fear and fascination surrounding them grew. The whispers that had once been private now found their way into public conversation, carried on the wind, spoken behind closed doors, and sometimes even shouted in defiance. The town's attempt to suppress the growing sense of unease was not limited to religious sermons. There were other, more subtle forms of control in place. The local authorities began to crack down on any gathering that involved discussions of the girls. Meetings that had once been harmless exchanges of gossip now became gatherings fraught with suspicion. Anyone caught talking about the red-haired girls in a way that deviated from the official narrative faced consequences. People who were suspected of harboring such beliefs were quietly warned, threatened with social ostracism, or worse. Some of the more outspoken individuals were arrested, their bodies forced into submission as a warning to others who might entertain thoughts of rebellion. Despite the growing repression, there were those who continued to hold on to their beliefs about the girls. The religious establishment, though powerful, could not extinguish every flicker of doubt. The presence of the red-haired girls was simply too strange, too unsettling to be dismissed as a coincidence or a simple biological anomaly. The fear that the girls might be connected to something darker, something ancient, was impossible to erase. For some, the girls were symbols of divine intervention, of retribution, of an impending reckoning. For others, they were proof that something beyond human understanding had entered their world, and that its purpose was unclear. The suppression by the religious leaders and the town's authorities did not go unnoticed by the enslaved population. In their eyes, it only confirmed that there was something to fear about the red-haired girls, something that the white population was trying to conceal. They understood, perhaps more clearly than anyone, that the presence of the girls was not just a social anomaly, it was a disruption of power, an affront to the established order that kept them oppressed. Whether the girls were messengers of a divine reckoning or harbingers of something more sinister, the very fact that the authorities were so desperate to silence the rumors only proved that the girls were more than just ordinary children. In the end, the public denial, the efforts to suppress the growing sense of fear, only added fuel to the fire. The more the town's leaders tried to push the red-haired girls into the realm of the ordinary and the explainable, the more their mystery deepened. The girls, who had first been seen as nothing more than oddities, became symbols of something larger, something that defied the authority of both church and state. The whispers did not die. Instead, they grew louder, and as they did, they began to shape the legacy of the red-haired girls in ways that no one could have anticipated. As the rumors surrounding the red-haired girls continued to escalate, so too did the tension within the town. What began as a strange curiosity among a few had transformed into a collective obsession. The more the town's leaders tried to suppress the growing fear and speculation, the more the situation spun out of control. The psychological impact of the red-haired girls' presence was profound, affecting not only the way people viewed the girls but also the way they saw themselves and their world. Fear and paranoia began to seep into every aspect of daily life, and the town found itself at the brink of a breakdown, unable to reconcile the growing mystery with its rigid beliefs. The first signs of this psychological shift were subtle but undeniable. It wasn't just that people were scared of the girls, they were beginning to question everything. The red-haired girls had become a symbol of the unknown, a force that couldn't be controlled or explained away by reason, religion, or authority. They were something else entirely, a manifestation of a world that seemed to operate outside the bounds of everyday logic. The more the town's leaders tried to stamp out the rumors, the more the girls seemed to embody everything that was unexplainable and uncontrollable. The fear that had started as a whisper now spread like wildfire, igniting a deep sense of paranoia among the townspeople. At the heart of this fear was a growing sense of powerlessness. In a town built on rigid hierarchies, where the social order was carefully maintained by the slave owners and the religious leaders, there was little room for the kind of mystery the red-haired girls represented. The town's leaders had spent years carefully crafting an image of control, a sense of dominance over both the enslaved and the natural world around them. But now, they were confronted with something that refused to be understood, something that challenged their authority and defied explanation. This growing sense of helplessness was perhaps most evident among the town's slave owners, who were used to having power over every aspect of their enslaved people's lives. The very idea that something beyond their control could exist, that the red-haired girls might possess powers they couldn't fathom, created a psychological crack in the otherwise rigid structure they had built. The enslaved population, on the other hand, began to see the girls not as a threat but as a symbol of something far more complex. For them, the girls represented the possibility of a force greater than the oppression they had endured for generations. Whether the red-haired girls were seen as divine messengers or as symbols of a coming rebellion, they began to embody hope. The idea that something outside of the usual channels of power might intervene in their lives, something uncontrollable, something mysterious, became a source of both fear and fascination. The enslaved, who had long relied on their spiritual beliefs to make sense of their suffering, began to interpret the presence of the girls as a sign that they were not alone, that there were forces in the world working to disrupt the established order. But this hope was tinged with fear, because with such a disruption came uncertainty, and uncertainty was often a precursor to violence and change. The fear that consumed the town was not just about the girls themselves, it was about what they represented. They were a mirror to the deepest anxieties of the townspeople. To the enslaved, they symbolized the unknown power that might one day come to overturn the social structure, to bring an end to their suffering. To the slave owners and the religious leaders, they embodied a threat to their control, to their very sense of identity and security. The presence of the red-haired girls became a psychological trigger, bringing to the surface a host of fears and unresolved tensions that had long been buried. The idea of rebellion, the fear of a supernatural force at work, and the uncertainty about the future all began to bubble to the surface, threatening to spill over into open conflict. The escalating tension took on a more concrete form as strange events began to occur with increasing frequency. Livestock, which had always been a source of income and stability for the town's slave owners, began to behave erratically. Cattle and horses would wander off, becoming lost or injured for no apparent reason. Crops failed without warning, despite the best efforts of the enslaved workers to tend to them. These unexplained phenomena were not just coincidental, they were seen as signs that something was amiss, something beyond the ordinary was happening. It was as though the natural world itself was in turmoil, reflecting the emotional and psychological upheaval taking place in the town. And as these strange events continued to unfold, the town's sense of order began to unravel. In response, the slave owners and town leaders began to tighten their grip on the community. Any mention of the red-haired girls in public was met with harsh reprimands, and gatherings where the subject was discussed were broken up by force. The message was clear: any belief in the supernatural, any acknowledgement of the girls' potential power, was not only dangerous but punishable. The fear of rebellion, of unrest, was palpable. But in trying to force the town to conform to their vision of reality, the leaders only deepened the sense of paranoia and fear. The more they tried to suppress the growing mystery, the more it seemed to expand. People began to wonder if the authorities were hiding something, if there was more to the story of the red-haired girls than anyone was willing to admit. The question was no longer just about the girls themselves, it was about what the girls represented, and why the authorities were so desperate to silence any talk of them. The psychological toll on the townspeople was severe. For the enslaved, the belief in the red-haired girls as a sign of divine intervention or rebellion became a source of quiet resistance. They spoke in whispers about the possibility of an uprising, of a day when the natural order would be upended. For the white population, particularly the slave owners, the psychological strain was just as intense. They lived in fear that their control was slipping away, that something was happening that they could not explain or control. The more they fought to maintain their power, the more they felt it slipping from their grasp, like sand through their fingers. It was in this atmosphere of escalating tension and fear that the first open signs of conflict began to surface. A group of enslaved people, emboldened by the belief that the red-haired girls were a symbol of impending change, began to organize. Whether or not they saw the girls as their leaders is unclear, but the girls had become a focal point for a rising sense of resistance. Rumors of whispered plans to escape or revolt spread quickly through the enslaved population, and while there is no concrete evidence that the girls themselves were involved in any acts of rebellion, their presence seemed to have sparked something. Perhaps it was the belief that they were the embodiment of some greater power, or perhaps it was the sheer fear of the unknown, but the red-haired girls had become symbols of defiance. The slave owners, for their part, began to tighten their grip even further. They increased surveillance on the enslaved, punished those who spoke of rebellion, and tried to quell the growing unrest. The psychological pressure on both sides reached a breaking point. Fear and suspicion hung in the air, and it was impossible to escape the sense that something was about to give. The red-haired girls, once simply an oddity, had now become a catalyst, a symbol of everything that could go wrong, a force that nobody could control, and a mystery that nobody could solve. The escalation of fear and paranoia had reached a boiling point, and as the tension mounted, it was clear that the situation could no longer remain contained. The psychological impact of the girl's presence had altered the town's dynamics irreparably. The seeds of rebellion had been planted, and the social fabric that had held the town together for so long was on the verge of unraveling. The red-haired girls, mysterious and enigmatic as they were, had become more than just children. They were symbols of a deeper, more profound unrest that had been bubbling beneath the surface for far too long. And in the midst of it all, no one knew what the final outcome would be, or what role the girls would play in the inevitable clash that was coming. As the fears surrounding the red-haired girls continued to grow, a shift began to occur among some of the more intellectual and educated members of the town. While the majority of people were consumed by superstition and dread, a few began to seek rational explanations for the unusual phenomenon. Science, as it was understood at the time, offered a framework in which the unexplainable could be dissected and categorized. The growing panic and the mounting rumors of witchcraft or divine intervention prompted a response from those who clung to the idea that reason could explain everything. They began to search for biological, genetic, and scientific explanations for the presence of these strange children with fiery red hair. At first, the discussions were tentative. The town's educated elite, who had long prided themselves on their adherence to scientific principles and rational thought, were reluctant to engage with the more mystical explanations circulating among the common folk. They were wary of the dangerous implications of these rumors and did not want to give them any credence. But the more the red-haired girls were discussed, the more impossible it seemed to ignore the physical anomaly that they represented. Could these girls, with their strikingly unusual appearance, really be the result of a simple genetic quirk? Were they the result of some rare mutation, an inexplicable variation in their bloodlines, or was there something deeper at play? A small group of local doctors and physicians began to take an interest in the phenomenon. They had heard the whispers and rumors, and while they were skeptical of any supernatural explanations, they could not deny the fact that something unusual was happening. One doctor, in particular, began to study the girls, conducting private observations and speaking to their families. He was determined to understand the cause of their physical differences, convinced that science could provide the answer. It wasn't long before he theorized that the girls' red hair might be the result of a rare genetic mutation, one that could occur sporadically within a population, even among people who had no known history of red-haired ancestors. He pointed to examples of similar genetic anomalies in other populations. Red hair was known to occur, albeit rarely, in other parts of the world, particularly in regions such as Scotland or Ireland, where the gene for red hair was more common. The doctor's theory was based on the idea that the girl's red hair might be the result of recessive genes, traits that could lie dormant for generations before suddenly reappearing in offspring. He argued that, given the complex and often unpredictable nature of inheritance, it was entirely possible for individuals with no apparent red-haired lineage to give birth to children with red hair, provided the right genetic combination occurred. To him, the girls were a rare, but not impossible, example of genetic variation. This explanation, though based in science, failed to calm the growing fear in the town. While the doctor's theory was plausible from a scientific perspective, it did little to ease the anxieties of the population. For many, the idea that the girl's appearance could be explained by genetics was not sufficient. It did not account for the strange behavior that some had observed, nor did it explain the eerie sense of foreboding that seemed to accompany their presence. As the doctor's theory gained some traction among those who were more inclined to accept rational explanations, others began to look for additional scientific reasons for the girl's uniqueness. Some suggested that the girl's red hair might be linked to a condition known as albinism, a genetic disorder that causes a lack of pigment in the skin, hair, and eyes. Albinism, while rare, was not unheard of, and some believed that the girl's pale skin and red hair might be a result of this condition. However, this theory quickly fell apart under closer scrutiny. While the girls did have pale skin, they did not display the other physical characteristics typically associated with albinism, such as light-colored eyes or a heightened sensitivity to light. This theory, while plausible on the surface, did not fully explain the girls' physical appearance or the other strange occurrences surrounding them. The more the town's scientific minds tried to find a rational explanation, the more elusive the truth seemed. Some began to turn their attention to the girls' behavior, hoping that by studying them more closely, they could uncover some clues that might provide an explanation. It was reported that the girls often appeared in the woods at night, sometimes together, sometimes alone, but always with an unsettling air of quietude. They were seen standing motionless, as though they were waiting for something, or perhaps even communing with some unseen force. Their eyes, though not unusual in their color, seemed to hold an intensity that many found disturbing. Some of the local physicians, believing that the girls' behavior could be linked to a mental condition or some form of psychological disorder, attempted to diagnose them. They speculated that the girls' unusual behavior was a manifestation of some deeper psychological issue, perhaps the result of extreme isolation or stress. However, these theories, like the genetic ones, failed to address the full scope of the mystery surrounding them. What was becoming clear was that the more the town tried to explain the girls' presence through scientific means, the more entrenched the mystery became. The idea of a simple genetic anomaly, or a rare condition, no longer seemed sufficient to explain everything that was happening. The strange occurrences that followed the girls, animals acting strangely, crops failing, sudden storms, could not be easily dismissed as coincidence. Nor could the townspeople ignore the growing sense of fear that was tied to their presence. There was something more at play here, something that science and rational thought alone could not explain. In their attempts to explain the phenomenon, the scientific minds of the town were also beginning to question their own assumptions about the world. The natural order, which had always seemed so fixed, suddenly felt more fragile. If something as simple as red hair could elicit such fear and suspicion, what did that say about the fragility of the town's understanding of the world around them? The more they tried to rationalize the girl's appearance, the more they found themselves confronting the limits of their knowledge. Despite the best efforts of the doctors and intellectuals to offer rational explanations, the fear surrounding the girls only deepened. The red-haired girls, once seen as mere curiosities, had become symbols of something far larger, a disruption in the natural order, a challenge to the town's understanding of the world. The more the town tried to contain the mystery, the more it grew. The red-haired girls had become something beyond explanation, a force that could not be categorized, a phenomenon that refused to be understood. In the end, the scientific theories failed to provide any real resolution. While they offered possible explanations, they did not account for the eerie atmosphere that surrounded the girls, nor did they address the growing sense of dread that gripped the town. The town's intellectuals had attempted to apply reason to an enigma that defied all logic, and in doing so, they had only deepened the mystery. The red-haired girls remained an unsolved riddle, one that science could not crack, and one that would continue to haunt the town for years to come. Their presence, inexplicable and unsettling, had forever altered the course of the town's history, leaving behind only questions that no one had the answers to. As the tension reached its peak, the town began to unravel in ways that no one had anticipated. What had started as an unusual occurrence, the appearance of the red-haired girls, had transformed into something far more insidious. The town was no longer simply divided over the nature of the girls. It was fracturing at its core. Fear, distrust, and confusion permeated every corner of the community, and as the mystery deepened, the once thriving town became a place where isolation and silence slowly took over. The more the townspeople tried to understand the phenomenon, the more they found themselves retreating into their own minds, their own beliefs, and their own fears. The authorities, both religious and secular, had failed to contain the growing panic. Despite their best efforts to suppress the rumors and maintain control, the red-haired girls had become a symbol of everything that could not be explained, a force that threatened the established order. As a result, the town's leadership began to take more drastic measures, attempting to isolate the girls from the rest of the population in the hopes of stopping the fear from spreading. But the more they tried to seclude the girls, the more their isolation seemed to intensify the mystery surrounding them. The girls themselves had become less visible in the town. The sightings grew fewer and fewer, until eventually, they disappeared almost entirely. Some claimed that they had been taken away by their families, hidden from the prying eyes of the town in an attempt to protect them from the growing hysteria. Others believed that the girls had been spirited away by some otherworldly force, whisked off to a place where they could no longer be harmed or studied. Whatever the truth was, their absence only deepened the sense of loss and foreboding that had settled over the town. In the wake of their disappearance, the town's isolation began to set in. Life in the town grew quieter, slower, as if the very air had been drained of its vitality. People went about their daily routines, but there was a palpable sense of something missing. The questions that had once consumed the town, about the girls, about their origins, about the strange events that had followed in their wake, remained unanswered. It was as if the girls themselves had taken the answers with them when they vanished, leaving behind only a trail of uncertainty. Those who had once been obsessed with the mystery began to turn inward, either repressing their fears or abandoning them entirely in favor of a kind of uneasy peace. But peace, as they soon discovered, was an illusion. The town's retreat into silence wasn't just social, it was psychological. People began to forget, or at least try to forget, what had happened. The whispers, once so rampant, became fewer and fewer, until they were nothing more than faint echoes of a past that no one wanted to confront. Religious leaders, eager to return to their routine of salvation and fire and brimstone sermons, focused on re-establishing the moral order. The discussions of the red-haired girls faded away in the pulpit, replaced by familiar warnings of sin and damnation. And yet, for those who had witnessed the events firsthand, the silence felt unnatural. It was a silence born not of resolution, but of repression. A silence that came from fear, from an unwillingness to face the truth of what had happened. The girls, once the focal point of so much fear and fascination, had now become little more than a forgotten oddity, a dark chapter that no one wanted to reopen. But while the town seemed to forget, the damage had already been done. The psychological toll of the red-haired girl's presence had taken root in the town's collective psyche. People no longer saw the world the same way. The town's once rigid belief system had been shaken to its core. There was no longer a comforting certainty in the natural order, no longer a belief that everything could be understood, explained, and controlled. The events surrounding the girls had introduced an element of chaos, of the unknown, into the town's worldview. And even though the girls had vanished, that sense of uncertainty remained. For some, it was like an insidious ghost that lingered, an unspoken fear that never truly went away. Life in the town continued, but the people within it had changed. Those who had once held positions of power, the slave owners, the religious leaders, the intellectuals, began to lose their influence. Without the certainty of the established order, they struggled to maintain control over the people. The enslaved population, who had once been forced into silence, now found their own sense of agency, albeit in small, quiet ways. The fear that had once been a tool of oppression no longer worked as it had before. The mystery of the red-haired girls had, in a way, cracked open a door to a different kind of reality, one where the established power dynamics could no longer be relied upon. And while no overt rebellion occurred, there was a growing sense of defiance, of quiet resistance. The town's retreat into silence may have been a means of survival, but it was also a surrender, an acknowledgement that the old ways of doing things were no longer enough. Meanwhile, those who had been closest to the girls, their families, also withdrew. Some of the enslaved women who had given birth to the girls vanished with them, taking refuge in nearby plantations or disappearing into the dense forests. It is unclear whether they sought to escape the scrutiny of the town, or if, in some way, they felt that the girls' presence had caused irreparable harm. Whatever the case, their silence became part of the larger silence that overtook the town. The enslaved mothers, who had once been the carriers of such profound mysteries, became figures of quiet mourning. Their lives, marked by both profound suffering and a strange sense of power, were now swallowed up by the town's inability to confront what had happened. They, too, faded into the background, part of the town's collective attempt to move on from the unexplainable. As the years passed, the story of the red-haired girls became little more than a local legend, a whisper carried on the wind, fading with time. New generations grew up with only vague recollections of the strange occurrence, of the unsettling children with hair like fire. The town, now fully isolated in its own fears and secrets, sought refuge in more mundane matters. The specter of rebellion, of supernatural forces at play, was left to haunt the pages of history, with no clear resolution in sight. Yet, even as the town retreated into its silence, the legacy of the red-haired girls endured. The unanswered questions lingered. Were the girls truly a sign of divine intervention, a manifestation of a higher power? Or were they merely the product of genetic chance, an anomaly that ignited the town's deepest fears? The town's efforts to bury the mystery had not erased it. The girls had become a part of the town's history, a story that would never be fully understood, a story that would never truly fade. In the end, the girls' disappearance marked the beginning of a new kind of silence, a silence that would echo in the town's consciousness for generations to come. Though they vanished from the world, the red-haired girls left behind something that could never be taken away, the awareness that some mysteries are too profound to be solved, too powerful to be ignored. The town, in its attempt to escape the fear they had caused, had found itself forever changed. The red-haired girls had not just altered the course of the town's history, they had exposed the fragility of the town's sense of order, and in doing so, they had ensured that the mystery of their existence would live on in the minds of those who remained. Years passed, and the town gradually moved into a quiet state of uneasy calm. The red-haired girls, once the center of the most fervent gossip and fear, faded into the background of history. For many, the events surrounding them became nothing more than a strange memory, a haunting chapter in the town's past that no one dared to reopen. In the wake of their disappearance, the town attempted to return to normalcy, but that return was marked by an unsettling silence, both social and psychological, that pervaded every aspect of life. The collective memory of the girls' presence, their disappearance, and the fear they instilled continued to reverberate long after the last whisper of their existence had been silenced. The local community, particularly those who had once been the most vocal in their opposition to the rumors, began to quietly distance themselves from the whole affair. The town's religious leaders, who had fervently denounced any supernatural explanations for the girls' existence, turned their attention back to more conventional matters. They resumed their duties with a renewed focus on maintaining control over the spiritual lives of the townspeople. The sermons became less about the strange occurrence of the red-haired girls and more about reinforcing the values of obedience and discipline, casting aside any mention of what had transpired. However, despite their best efforts to return to the comfort of routine, the shadow of the red-haired girls remained. Though no one spoke of them aloud, they lingered in the minds of the people, a reminder that the world could sometimes be beyond their understanding. The town's social structure, once so firmly rooted in its hierarchy, began to show signs of strain. The events surrounding the girls had caused a shift in the town's perception of power. Though the slave owners were quick to reassert their dominance in the wake of the crisis, the psychological toll of the fear and uncertainty had left an indelible mark on both them and the enslaved. There was an unspoken recognition that the carefully constructed world of the masters was not as invulnerable as they had once believed. The mysterious disappearance of the girls had shattered the illusion that everything could be controlled, and for those who had been forced to maintain power over others, there was a quiet fear that such uncontrollable forces might one day reappear, unbidden, to disrupt their lives again. It was a subtle, almost imperceptible change, but it was there, lingering just beneath the surface. For the enslaved population, however, the aftermath of the red-haired girls' appearance marked a quiet shift in their understanding of their own fate. They had witnessed the mysterious power the girls seemed to possess, whether divine, supernatural, or something else entirely, and many began to hold on to that fleeting sense of hope, even if they no longer dared to speak of it openly. In the years that followed, some enslaved people began to quietly defy their masters in small, seemingly insignificant ways. The rigid lines of power had been altered by the events of the girls' existence, and while no overt rebellions or uprisings took place, the sense of fear among the slave owners was palpable. The red-haired girls had planted a seed of doubt in the minds of the oppressors, a seed that grew in the silence, nurtured by the unspoken belief that some things in the world were simply beyond control. Meanwhile, the families who had been closest to the girls, the ones who had raised them, gradually faded into obscurity. The mothers, who had once been central figures in the mystery, now kept to themselves, their lives marked by a quiet mourning. Some say they moved away, seeking refuge in neighboring towns or plantations, while others simply withdrew into the anonymity of everyday life, their stories never fully told. The silence that followed the girls' disappearance extended to them as well, and their once vocal role in the community was replaced by an impenetrable quiet. Over time, they became figures of myth, their identities obscured by time and secrecy. Were they part of the mystery that had surrounded the girls, or were they simply victims of the same forces that had governed the lives of the enslaved? No one knew, and in the end, few were willing to ask. The truth, like so many other truths in the town, was buried beneath the weight of silence. The town itself, now irrevocably changed, became more insular. The fear of the red-haired girls and the unanswered questions about their existence had pushed the town inward, away from the outside world. It became a place where the past was carefully ignored, where painful truths were tucked away in favor of a more comfortable, though fragile, peace. Outsiders, whether travelers or new settlers, were met with a cold reception, and the history of the red-haired girls was rarely, if ever, discussed. The town became a place where old stories were swept under the rug, where the disquieting questions of the past were silenced in favor of a more harmonious, if strained, present. But even in the silence, the mystery of the girls continued to haunt the town. Those who had lived through the events were forced to carry that burden for the rest of their lives. In their most private moments, they would sometimes recall the strange, almost otherworldly presence of the girls, the way they seemed to move with an eerie grace, the way they had captured the imagination of everyone they encountered. For some, the memory was one of awe and wonder, a sense that the girls had been something truly special, perhaps even touched by something divine. For others, the memory was darker, more unsettling. They remembered the fear, the way the air seemed to thicken when the girls were near, the sense that something unnatural was at work. But in the end, the town was left with nothing but the absence of answers. Generations later, the story of the red-haired girls became a local legend. The details had faded with time, but the core of the story remained. They were still spoken of in hushed tones, still remembered as something extraordinary, something that had once disrupted the course of the town's history. But the questions about their origins, their powers, and their purpose were never fully answered. It was as if the girls had passed through the town like a fleeting shadow, leaving behind only a trail of uncertainty and a sense of lingering dread. The mystery of the red-haired girls became a part of the town's collective memory, something that would never quite be forgotten, even if it was never fully understood. The town's leaders, the enslaved, and the everyday people who had lived through those dark days all carried the weight of that mystery, each in their own way. Some tried to ignore it, burying it deep within their minds, while others embraced it as a part of the town's strange and twisted history. But the impact of the girls' brief presence could not be erased. It had changed the town forever, altering the way people saw themselves, their world, and their place within it. In the end, the mystery of the red-haired girls was never solved. Their story became a cautionary tale, a reminder that there are some questions that are too dangerous to answer, too unsettling to confront. The town's silence, which had initially been a refuge, became its own form of imprisonment. For in that silence, the truth remained buried, forever out of reach, leaving only the ghosts of unanswered questions to haunt the town for generations to come.